excited to welcome everyone into How Not to Appropriate Kids Yoga, our workshop with Rabia Meghani, pronouns she, her, hers. And this workshop is really a part 3 of our conversation. We were able to sit together and have a community hour conversation in December on kids yoga ethics. And then we went live on Instagram to get a little bit more in detail about what you might expect for this workshop. And today is really part 3 of all of those conversations. Each had a distinct topic and really helped you get to know what we're about to introduce for the next 90 minutes. So I'm really excited to have you here, Rabia. And I've been really loving getting to know you, not just through your classes at Thejal Yoga, which you have two. Wednesday mornings, you have All Beings Meditation, and Thursday afternoon evenings, you have restorative yoga and poetry readings that you offer to us from some of your favorite poets. Um, so getting to know you from the classes that you offer and just the soft guidance that you offer in those classes has been really lovely, but also learning your passion in figuring out better education for kids in K through 12 that incorporates mindfulness has been really inspiring for me. And also your background in research, your background in education, your vision to lobby for the vision that you have for K through 12 kids, all of that has been so inspiring to me. So I think we're really grateful and honored to have you guide us through this conversation and walk us through all the takeaways and objectives that we can get through today, knowing that you're available every week in your practices and in your classes for us to build a relationship with you ongoing. So I will pass it over to you and let you kind of move forward with all your plan. This conversation is going to be recorded. The entire workshop will be recorded, and the replay will be sent to everyone who's reserved on Friday. So you'll get 90 days from Friday to sit with this recording, to revisit it as much as you need, and you'll have plenty of ideas, I'm sure, that will come up and ways to kind of follow up with those ideas with both Rabia and myself. But without further ado, I'm just going to pass it over and I will be snacking and taking notes throughout the whole time.
That sounds great. Hey, y'all. My name is Rabia Meghani. I use she, her pronouns. I am super, super excited about our time here together. As Sejal kind of said, this is part 3 of an ongoing conversation we've had. Um, this has been a vision of, I would say, ours, both Sejal and mine, for a little less than a year now, beginning to have discourse around what does something like this look like. And it all started with conversations that started with, like all good things do, venting about my current experiences, and now learning how to have that applicable discussion around how to bridge these gaps. So that's what we're going to get into today. But before we really just dive into our practice, if you're familiar with my classes, I really am a big fan of setting the foundation, both physically and mentally, before coming into something and really practicing the tools that we want to offer to the children. So taking a moment, just come into a comfortable seat if you aren't already. If you're on a chair like me, you're welcome to come to the edge of your seat so that your feet are really firmly planted into the ground. I like to move from side to side and sometimes even move my glutes out of the way so I can really feel my sits bones rooted into my seat. Taking a deep breath in here. And as we exhale, softening into the seat, allowing the body to feel supported, held. And from that foundation, we'll build up, lengthening, sitting up tall through the spine, taking the shoulders, rolling them up, back, and down. A gentle lift in the crown of the head. And a moment here just to connect with your breath. So you're welcome to place one hand on the heart, one hand on the belly to better feel the movement of the breath in the body. And on the next inhale, we'll gently begin to deepen the breath as we inhale in, fill the belly up with air. And exhale, release. 2 more times, just like that. Inhale, deep breath in. Exhale, let it go. One more time, breathing in. And exhale, release. Allowing the breath to return to its normal state, resting, and the entering and the exiting of the breath in the body, feeling the cooling sensation of the breath entering and exiting the nostrils. And a gentle reminder that the breath, as always, is our anchor. Anytime we feel distracted, overwhelmed, lost in thoughts, throughout this workshop, throughout the duration of our day, we gently, kindly guide the awareness back to the breath. Gently beginning to flutter the eyelids open if they were closed, taking a look around your environment, maybe pausing your gaze on one thing, form or function, emotional value that you're extremely grateful for today. And slowly bringing our attention back to the screen. And let's get into our workshop for today. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that you can see my slides. There we go. Thumbs up if you can see this. All right. Awesome. Cool. All right. Hey, y'all. Welcome to the How Not to Appropriate Kids Yoga Workshop. Like I said, this has been a little bit of the brainchild of ours for the past year. Something that we've been really working towards and finding that right time to get to, and all the conversations that we had through the community hour and the lives has really just been building up to our time here together. So I'm really, really excited about this. I'm extremely passionate about this topic in many ways that it also relates to myself and my own timeline, but also in the experiences that I've had as an educator and as a yoga therapist. So I am really, really excited to get into this conversation with you all. Without further ado, let's get into it. So a quick introduction about myself. I am a medical researcher, just like how Thejal mentioned, a behavioral therapist, yoga therapist, and I am an AMI trained Montessori educator. So these are all just the accolades that you can take time to read through, but really just want to share more about finding the parallels between my work has been extremely important to me. So knowing where and how these spaces can really correlate and intersect has been important, and bridging those gaps has been a huge part of my work. I want to share an integral part of why all of this is important to me. As a child of immigrant myself, navigating the school system in my brown skin, the tools of yoga, mindfulness, and Ayurveda were the foundation I needed, and that have ultimately shaped this path that you're seeing here, and why I feel like it is so necessary in the current school systems with the way that the world is moving currently, and how children need more of that foundation in their practices to create from there and help to navigate the world around them. So here's our agenda for today that we're going to get into. And what I plan on covering. An important point when we reach the actionable items on the bottom that I'll get into a little bit in just a moment here, but we're going to talk a little bit about yoga for kids, why it's important, why do we feel like it really needs to be implemented into those spaces. We're going to deep dive into Montessori philosophy. If you've been coming to the lives or the community hour, you've been hearing me say social emotional learning, and we're finally going to talk about what it is and why it's important and why those intersect. And then, of course, moving on to the intersection of yoga and education. So really seeing those parallels, having a visual on that. And we'll talk about the current method on why it's not working, right? So we're going to kind of just do an overview on the way children are receiving yoga currently and why maybe it's not matching up to the parallel that we're going to go through before that. And what can we do about all this? So when we get to that part, I really want in the actionable items to invite you all to think of this as more of dialogue to create the framework of how we can move forward now, having all the information that we're going to have talked about. So while I do intend on sharing more of ways that we can bridge these gaps, I want this to be a little bit more, or I invite this to be a little bit more interactive in the way that we are all going to have more discourse around how we feel in our own individual timelines. We can work together to create and work on taking away these gaps, on allowing children to receive yoga and mindfulness in the school systems. So my vision, similar to how I mentioned earlier, is being able to equip children in their homes throughout the school system with empowering and healing tools that can create the necessary foundation for them to navigate the obstacles that they encounter on their own respective timelines. And I truly believe, knowing how much education plays a large part in the timelines of children and how important the tools of yoga are in the current state of where we are as community, as in the world, bringing this intersection can create a powerful change and really truly create that foundation that is going to help set up these children for success. So let's talk about the obvious on why this is so imperative for children. As you may have noticed, I do have a bias with the feeling that these practices are absolutely vital for children. And here's why. Schools have become increasingly unsafe and have created a general culture of fear and lack of safety. We've seen this throughout the year. We've seen this in many ways that parents are now preparing their children to enter school with the current circumstances that we're in. And knowing that this is on the forefront of their mind, knowing that these type of protocols are having to learn is, of course, going to create that increased level of fear. COVID-19, especially, I was teaching children during that time virtually. So, of course, on the educator space, but also for children, it was such a difficult space to navigate within the school system. There was virtual learning, there was hybrid learning, but also how much fear was being absorbed within the homes, with media outlets. And so that particular time I felt was just a very, very stressful period for children. And of course, navigating the school system. I never learned well the way I was taught in the public school system. So navigating the school system for students who are neurodivergent, cannot engage with the material that they're presented, can be extremely difficult to understand. And of course, many schools, especially the public school system, as we know, is not a leveled playing field. However, we're all expected, no matter whatever the starting point for each student is to excel in all these boxes that we've created. Some may have the resources to be able to navigate these systems, but the majority of children are constantly just on this uphill battle of trying to win this race that they do not have the tools or are not equipped to do well at. And especially here, the BIPOC, LGBT, and transgender youth. So thinking about now having a framework of how the current school system is and how it's not setting up the majority of the students to succeed in many different ways. These are just a few pointers. And of course, the list goes on and on. I'm sure you individually in your own experience can think of many different ways why these tools are so important for children. But just to name and to bring awareness on why I feel this is so necessary to start having more conversation around. Now, because Montessori philosophy is my focus and what I've studied and trained in extensively, I wanted to give some background information on it. And I feel that Montessori philosophy, while it's not completely accessible to all, because in the public school system, Montessori philosophy is not necessarily addressed, and Montessori is more private focused and not all have resources to this type of learning. I feel that it's important to just have a basic understanding of what this philosophy is and why it can be super helpful in not just public school spaces, but also in the home if that's been your interaction with children. So talking about the few main concepts, one being the sensitive periods. And the sensitive periods are referring to the blocks of times that children go through. So initially, there's this need for order for children. So looking for that structure, needing stability, having all these things around them to create that stable foundation. Then they go through the sensitive period of language where they're absorbing the refinement of senses, the way that they interact with the world around them with their senses, and then the refinement of their movements. So really, if you think about this, it's like the child finding themselves in the world and their place in it and how to orient. So the reason why we have the sensitive periods in the way that they are most importantly for understand is how to assist the child to navigate these different periods of their lives. And I talked a little bit about absorption and adaptation, and that's a little bit of the next concept of human tendencies. So there are several tendencies that Dr. Montessori talks about that children have within them, but one of the biggest ones, and I think is really important, is adaptation. So adaptation and sensitive periods can go a little bit hand in hand, because the whole point of all the tools necessary that we're trying to provide to children is to help them to adapt to the world around them. So we're thinking of this child coming in with zero information on what's happening around them. We now have this understanding that they're going through these intentional blocks of time in which they're absorbing one thing more than the other, while all of them are working in parallel, but there are those blocks of times where certain needs or certain periods are heightened. And ultimately, we're leading to adaptation. How can we best assist in providing that order, providing that structure? How do we provide a picture of what it is the child is going to absorb of the world around them and their role in it, right? And then we go into 4 planes of development. 4 planes of development are broken up into time periods of the child's life. So 0 to 6, 6 to 12, so on and so forth. Each of these planes of developments come with their own needs and wants. And that's a really important part here, is that we're really prioritizing the child's needs and wants of what it is that they're looking for in the respective period of their life. So going back to order now, and order being a really big part of that first plane of development, structure and foundation and having a clear image of what your environment looks like and your role in it is an imperative for the child. A big part of Montessori philosophy, which I truly feel like all of it is, but one thing that I think that has always come up for me is adult responsibilities and obstacles. And I'm saying them together because sometimes I feel like the adults in the child's life can become those very obstacles. And to explain a little bit more about that is the responsibility of the adult is to make sure there's no hindrances in the way that the child is adapting in the respective period that they're in. However, when we have biases on the way that we want children to learn, when we want to control what it is that they're taking in, when we're introducing them to information and material that is curated based off of a model that is just based off of profit, we are now becoming that hindrance in the child's development, right? So thinking about if our responsibility is to create safe spaces for the child to learn without distractions, to absorb, to learn about themselves, to learn about their place in the world, to learn about their specific environment that they are a part of, and specific environment too, now being that it's very specific per child. Each and every child has a different environment that they come from. They live in different places. They have different upbringing. So every part of this philosophy is unique to the child. So if the adult here now, the responsibility of the adult is to really just create a conducive space for the child, that really requires a lot of preparation for the adult in this situation of putting aside those biases, putting aside what it is that we think we want the child to learn, and allowing this to be extremely child-led and motivated. Now, this, if we're already beginning to see a little bit of that parallel that we're going to go into deeply about yoga too, but understanding that Montessori philosophy comes from an extremely empowering space, that we're wanting to equip the child with the tools necessary for them to be able to learn about their environment and then to be able to best navigate it. So while Montessori philosophy isn't what the staple is in public school spaces and isn't just the, I guess, the standard across the board for how children are learning, I feel that these concepts are extremely relatable in our personal interactions with children and can be employed within the classroom outside of the general structure that we're meant to follow. And the last two being a part of them as well is that knowing and having information that children go through these different periods of their life, how do we best prepare ourselves to be able to provide the child with that necessary information and to make sure that they're not having any obstacles in the way that they're learning? Okay. All right. So I want to talk about a very, very, very foundational pillar of Montessori philosophy that I think ties extremely hand in hand with where I'm going with the way that children are receiving yoga now and the way that I feel like it's imperative for them to learn is imagination versus fantasy. In the community hour, we spoke a little bit about this too, because there's a lot of information about this in yoga philosophy itself of imagination versus fantasy that I hope we can have a conversation on later down the road. But for the purposes of learning about that in education spaces, we want to talk about what imagination is first. So imagination is all about creativity. It's all about what's allowing the creativity in the child to flourish, to create something that does not exist yet from something that already exists. So taking from their foundation of what they know the world is, how they know things work. And from that space, creating concepts and now taking that imagination and turning into something that can be a part of the world that they're living in currently. Imagination has a lot to do with a connection to reality. Although it's something that we're using a little bit more creatively to be able to explore and learn about and to create, it has to do with what we have currently been in contact now. So if we think about when we create solutions, or we think creatively in the way that we perceive music, art, media, it all comes from a space of our current realities and what we've already been exposed to. And that's a big difference between imagination and fantasy. So that's just laying a little bit of framework for what imagination is. Now let's talk about fantasy. Fantasy, on the other hand, is creating in the mind things that are not from our environment, that are concepts beyond reach. So fantasy in this way is now thinking of something completely different, idealistic, utopic, that is away from something that we've already experienced or is applicable to our life now. And this form of learning can be extremely harmful for many reasons, especially to children, because one, talking about how important adaptation is, it really hinders their ability to adapt to their environment. If we give them in these sensitive periods, in these times that they're absorbing, if we now are only giving them information that is not connecting to their reality, we are now becoming that obstacle, that hindrance for them to adapt to the world around them and what the role that they play in this place. Right? That's one thing. The other thing is that putting fantasy in the mind of a child who is now absorbing their environment, and what we give them as a world is what they perceive the world is, right? Children, especially in the household, what they see in the house is what they think the world is, which is why they go out and do the same thing. So if we are now introducing fantasy, this can turn into a coping mechanism of disassociating and not being in touch with their reality. So there's two key differences between imagination and fantasy, and why one is something that fosters creativity, while the other can become an obstacle or hindrance in the adaptation of children. Are there any questions so far of anything I can clarify between the two? Yeah, go ahead. Jazzy? Yeah.
Hi. Can y'all hear me? Is it cool?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Hello everyone. I'm Jazzy. I'm so excited to kind of like hear and be in this conversation as a yoga teacher in the Bronx. So fantasy is a whole other thing. So one of my questions is, and maybe, and you don't have to answer it now, or maybe it'll come up later on, is we might all be dealing with kids that live in a fantasy just through their technology, games, everything, trying to get them to think about you're a tiger is like beyond them at the moment. So when you're in a space where you're dealing with kids that are playing games on a constant basis and wanting them to use their imagination, how does that come into play when teaching yoga or any of, when you're in the space of like being a teacher and teaching the stuff, like trying to teach them yoga and how it could be supportive?
Yeah, totally. Thanks for your question. So that's one of the biggest roadblocks that we're really hitting at this point right now, right? Because we have so many different obstacles in the way that we want children to be introduced to decolonized form of yoga. And we have already the way that the school system is currently, we have the way that children are learning yoga currently, and then we have all this, right? We have all these like environmental factors of the way that children are exposed to technology currently and the way that fantasy is being introduced to them. That becomes a really difficult part in how to navigate these practices in a sustainable and accessible way. For me, I've noticed is that we have to, and talking a little bit, and I'll go back here for a second too, in the 4 planes of development in the sensitive periods, I talked a little bit about the needs and wants of children. A big need for kids, especially in that first plane of development, when they're really searching for that order, is the why and the what behind what they're being introduced to. This is where, as educators And as teachers and practitioners of yoga and the interactions that we have with children, we really have to have practices and answers to these questions that are extremely empowering. Children want to know and learn way more than we think that they want to. And this is also something that's rooted in Montessori philosophy, is we are often undermining how much capacity children have in their ability to understand these difficult concepts, right? It can be our responsibility to give these concepts piecemeal, but at the same time, there is a deeper need and want to learn about what they're doing and why they're doing. When we see children losing interest in education because we're teaching at them and we're expecting them to fit their unique selves into these boxes, we see this drop off of receptivity and learning and understanding, because you can't explain to the child why you're learning this or why this is going to be important, right? There's so many concepts that you and I have probably gone through in the school system that we don't use now, that make no sense, that we could have had more practical tools on understanding. I think the responsibility of the teacher and the educator, when we talk about the adult responsibilities here, is to be extremely empowering in the conversation that we're having with children. So when we try to employ these tools in the classroom, to be extremely informative on why this is happening and to create an open dialogue and discourse on when those questions come up, and to be able to answer them in a way that they'll be able to absorb, right? So older children, for instance, really like to understand. Younger children love the movement or love to explore and be more creative, whereas when the children are going through their journey in the planes of development, are extremely curious and want to know a lot. So for instance, if I have anywhere between 4th through 6th graders, you can start talking about the brain. You can start talking about the parasympathetic nervous system. You can start talking about the nervous, like the sympathetic nervous system. You can talk about when that switch happens. You can talk about when we take that deep breath in, we exhale, we're really triggering that vagus nerve. What's the vagus nerve? It's part of the 10 cranial nerves. What does it do? It turns on the parasympathetic nervous system. Giving them this information and then allowing them to play with it. So, okay, now you know about how the brain works. Now practice together. Let's take a deep breath in. Let's exhale. And continuing that to be a part of the daily practice, and then allowing themselves to be able to notice that difference within their own body, right? We live in a space now with children being extremely disconnected, because of that fantasy, like you mentioned, is extremely prominent in all the interactions that they're having. B, technology, the fear, all of those things are making children live outside of their bodies. And so establishing that connection with the body is going to take time, but it's also going to take routine practice. So whether that is doing practices just like how we started at the beginning of this class of rooting down, creating foundation, planting your feet into the ground, simple things that help trigger the parasympathetic nervous system, we start employing that. We start talking about that, right? We start talking about what changes when you smile, when you're feeling upset. We start talking about the research behind things like that. Surprisingly, kids love data. They love to understand why they're doing what they're doing. So when we employ these practices, an invitation here is to think deeply about the questions what might arise during the time, knowing your own classroom, knowing your students, knowing the kids that you interact with daily, but also coming from an empowering space. So really thinking, and this is something that's really helped me, is to think about when I was a child and somebody was teaching a technique to me, I would have really liked to know why I'm doing what I'm doing, how it's going to help me. And another unique part is to how to make this practice my own, because that's the accessible feature that we're missing at the moment. So giving children the tools and the knowledge to learn about what they're doing, for them to make it sustainable. But in order for them to make it sustainable in their own way, we have to have dialogue around, and you make this unique to what's important to you. So one thing about practicing mindfulness with children is that sitting in silence is not extremely accessible for a lot of kids. However, if you allow their interest to drive their mindfulness, they're more likely to be more present in whatever it is they're participating in. So if one child is more driven towards movement, if one is more musically inclined, if we allow their inclination, am I back? Okay. If we allow their inclination to guide their practice, we are going to work towards more success and having sustainability in them finding that routine in their practice, and not seeing mindfulness as something that's outside of what they're already doing, but connecting that living in the present moment has to do everything with their unique selves. That makes sense? I know that was a really long answer to your question, but I could talk about this all day. Okay, cool. Is any other comments or questions or anything that anyone would like to just even chime in on?
I guess I have a quick question about when fantasy could be beneficial to kids or people. And like, because I feel that kids are very introduced to fantasy when they're younger through like TV shows and things like that.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious just about any research on fantasy introduced later in life, or like when it's more appropriate.
Yeah. Great question, Jillian. And this is something that I have an answer to, because fantasy can be introduced to children. And in Montessori philosophy, it is said that introducing fantasy after the age 6 is a little bit more appropriate. The reason why we don't want to do that before is because the cortex of the child is still developing and it's still immature. So we don't want to bring in all these abstract concepts into the mind where the child is not being able to distinguish real from imaginary. But after 6 is where we can do this. Now, I say this with a caveat because I think that each child is extremely unique in the way that they're learning. I think that we can't give it like a hard cap of like, oh, okay, if they're 6, they're good to go, right? I think there's a lot of different moving parts and pieces in the way that children develop, and reaching the age 6 for one child and their development could look completely different for another. So we can here even assess and allow this to be extremely child driven. Having this be a part of the model that we're going to use in that one size fits all, I feel that isn't extremely sustainable, because again, it's not really addressing each child's development. But if there's tends to, in your interaction with children, that curiosity is coming forth in the dialogue that they're having with you, if you notice that in their personal development, and if you can assess in your role with them that they're ready for a little bit more of an introduction on what fantasy could look like and how you could incorporate it into the practice, I think that's a good time to bring it in. But for the purposes of understanding why there's a distinction between the two and why one can be a little bit more harmful when given at an early age, it's important to just understand what fantasy can do and where it can go down if we in the adult responsibility space aren't really assessing the damage it can have, or not really thinking about whether or not the child is ready for that form in their stage of development. Does that answer your question, Jillian?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, awesome. All right, yes. Just want to share a quote here from Dr. Maria Montessori. So, if then the true basis of imagination is reality and perception is related to exactness of observation, it is necessary to prepare children to perceive the things in their environment exactly in order to secure for them the material required by imagination. So this is going back to a little bit of what I was saying. This is a bit of a wordy quote, so I'll go through it with you. But this is what I meant when I said earlier about allowing what already exists to guide the imagination of the child to now creatively start thinking about what doesn't exist yet. So having that solid foundation and that established relationship with their environment first, and allowing that to guide where their imagination can take them based off of what they already know. All right. Now, for social emotional learning, this is extremely powerful stuff for me. I remember when I came across social emotional learning, it was mind-blowing to me. So let's go ahead and just read this definition from Kessel. So we defined social and emotional learning, SEL, as an integral part of education and human development. SEL is the process through which all young people and adults acquire and apply the knowledge, skills, and attitudes to develop healthy identities, manage emotions, and achieve personal and collective goals. Feel and show empathy for others, establish and maintain and make responsible and caring decisions. So, whoa, that's a lot. And I think that this is so, so, so important because at its roots, social emotional focus learning is all about strengthening that internal locus of control for the child. So for the child to feel, or the student in this case, to feel secure with who they are, and it's truly an empowering practice, which if you haven't caught on to yet, is extremely similar to authentic yoga. It's all about creating that foundation. This now again ties into Montessori philosophy. Montessori philosophy employs tactics of social emotional learning, but social emotional learning on its own, as its own thought and school of thought, is all about how to empower the child to build from the inside out. So not externalizing their needs, but giving them the tools to really feel that strength within themselves, and then allowing that to guide their relationships and their interactions outside of themselves. This to me, of course, could have been extremely helpful when I was learning to navigate the school system, and if had that been the approach that I had been introduced to. But also, when you think about practicing yoga and you think about practicing yoga authentically, there's such a clear parallel for me right here of empowering, of understanding, of applying, of creating healthy identities of yourself around you, your emotions, showing empathy, and establishing supportive relationships. I want to talk a little bit about the 5 components of SEL. So let's take a look at this chart. And when I first saw this chart many moons ago, I was so excited. It made so much sense to me. Like, yeah, of course, this is a no-brainer. That's exactly how it's supposed to be. There's 5 main components of social emotional learning, which is self-awareness, self-management, responsible decision-making, relationship skills, and social awareness. It starts inward and then all goes outward. And the practice of yoga, again, is just that. So when we talk about self-study, swadhyaya, learning, identifying, understanding the self, and having that as a foundation to be able to navigate the world around us, right? This model of learning is really setting up the child for success, because we're thinking more about not the child adhering to these systems that we've created, but creating a system that supports the child for them to be able to now navigate all the obstacles that they're going to face in the different spaces of their own time, right? So this could be not just in the school system, but also in the way that they're navigating life outside. But being an important tool navigating the school system, especially higher education spaces, we know from research that BIPOC students don't have great receptivity rates in higher education spaces. So creating this foundation now in a public school setting really allows children to feel more supported and continues to have that strengthening within themselves and their relationship with themselves to be able to better take on, and as we see in this diagram here too, now their relationship with the classroom, with schools, family, caregivers, aligned learning and opportunities. But all of it is about foundation. And the same thing with yoga. When we talk about yoga, when we start off our journey with yoga, when we know about the limbs, it's all about the yamas and the niyamas. We're talking about foundation here. We're talking about how to set the space. We're talking about cleaning up. We're talking about studying. We're talking about understanding. We're talking about surrender. So all of these different things are the same foundation of creating strength within ourselves for us to be able to then journey forward and feel more equipped and empowered. Alrighty. Any questions or comments about social emotional learning or anything that you've encountered in your own experiences that you want to chime in on? No, all good. Alrighty. Let's move on this way. All right, let's talk about the very extreme clear parallels. And then after I go through each one of them, I do want to open up a little bit of dialogue on also how you can see these parallels, either before we've had this discussion or something that's really popped up for you in this time. But one thing that's really similar now that we've talked about Montessori philosophy now that we've discussed what social emotional learning looks like, now that we've talked about the necessity of having yoga in the classroom, and of course, knowing the way that yoga is itself, yoga inherently in and of itself and Montessori philosophy of social emotional learning does not make the child fit the philosophy. The philosophy is to be adapted for the child to feel most safe and comfortable for them to be able to explore from their own foundation. We do not have a one size fit all model when it comes to yoga. There is not a one size fit all model when it comes to social emotional learning as well as Montessori philosophy. Both practices are inherently trauma informed, right? They both come from a space of coming to empower and to make accessible for the person who is practicing or the child that is practicing. It is, both practices are led by the interest of the practicer. So Montessori philosophy, if you ever had the opportunity to be in a Montessori classroom, it's wild, because if you've ever come from a public school space and you've looked into a Montessori classroom, you see like 3-year-olds ironing clothes and you're trying to understand what's happening here. But it's that all activities in the environment are led by the child regardless of the age. So it's extremely empowering and also allowing the child to be able to trust their own instincts and to be able to move forward from what they find is most authentic to themselves. So again, not taking the child or the person and fitting them into the box, but reshaping, breaking, burning the box to now be able to fit the needs and the inclinations of the child or the person. We see this with adult yoga. We see this with how children learn. And your personal experience with yoga, and I'll tell you a little bit about mine too, is that we have this path, we have the limbs, we have all that we follow. However, I know personally that my natural inclination is completely towards meditation. I know that that's something that I'm extremely driven towards. So I allowed that inclination then to be what helps me be rooted to the overall practice. Both practices, like we spoke about, social emotional, Montessori philosophy, and yoga philosophy, the decolonized form that we're speaking of here, is all about empowering and strengthening the relationship with the self. It's all about understanding. And a lot of this could be unlearning and with the conditioning that we know of now. But truly, truly understanding the self and allowing that to be the foundation that you build off of. I really feel strongly about having this be a part of the lives of children, whether it be in the school space or in the home. Because with adults, and we know about this, and a lot of our conversations at Visual Yoga are similar with adults, we have a lot of unlearning to do when it comes to our relationship with yoga. We go through a whole period of participating in colonized yoga, feeling super uncomfortable while doing it, and then having to undo all the stuff and coming back to what we already thought was authentic, and then to find community in that. It's a mess, y'all. But with children, we have this foundation that we're creating, right? Going back and drawing back to what I said about adult responsibility, we have a huge responsibility as educators or as adults in the lives of children to be able to give them empowering practices. And the really, really great thing about children here now is that you can very well be that first introduction of these empowering techniques for them. So instead of unlearning and undoing and rewriting, we're giving them that path that is rooted in the way that yoga is meant to be practiced. And we're also doing it in a way that's conducive to their learning. That's important, right? Because we're going to talk a little bit about the way that yoga is for children now, and we all know how it is for the most part. And so knowing and having this responsibility, we can basically help create a stronger foundation for children for them to navigate their lives instead of having to undo and unlearn. Now, with all of this being said, and in my own personal experience, it's great to be able to introduce this to children and being this introduction to them and doing it the proper way. However, there's a lot of bureaucracy and red tape that goes around in the school systems, right? And we're going to talk a little bit about that in our conversation when we talk about bridging those gaps. So even thinking now, systemic change. What are different methods and conversations that we can start having that can create a system-wide change, because children are just one small and sometimes not even prioritized piece of the school system. So thinking about all the different ways and things that go into place, when we want to implement this in children. But to come back to that at a later time, I just want to wrap up my thought on children can really be that place where we can start off and do it right and allow them to learn in a way that they can learn and make it their own and take it and adapt and create something extremely beautiful out of it that can undo some of the harm that we've seen now in the past with the way that yoga has been represented. And of course, both practices here are rooted in being present mindfulness. So if you notice with Montessori philosophy, social emotional learning, yoga philosophy, all of it, in the Montessori classroom, each child is doing one thing at a time. If you are working with beads, for instance, you can only pick one bead at a time. This is also refining their motor skills, it's refining their movements, it's really cultivating patience and presence, but it's all about being in the present moment. So both of those practices are ultimately creating a foundation of mindfulness for the child to continue to be rooted in the present moment, to continue to strengthen their awareness of the present moment, and to continue to strengthen their relationship with the breath and where they are in this moment right now, instead of continuing to disassociate. So those are a little bit about the parallels, but I do want to open it up here if anybody has any comments on the parallels that they've noticed or have come across in their timelines, or any questions too.
Question, if that's okay.
Yeah, go for it.
So you might be touching on this in a little bit, but we run a program in the South, and I'm so thankful that everything you're saying is essentially what we're trying to do with the children, but we are constantly fighting an uphill battle about the understanding of yoga, despite how much education we try to give people. So is there a way that you approach a school, a parent that you find successful when they say, this is against my religion, my child cannot do yoga? And to the point where we have even taken the word yoga out and we say movement and mindfulness, which is a shame, and that's not our intention, but just to get it to, that's sometimes what we have to do. So if you have any advice, I'd love to hear that.
Yeah, totally. Thank you for your question. It's an extremely important one. And we could even, I feel like this in and of itself could be its own discussion because of how problematic the current systems are. And yes, we will touch on it, but I do want to talk about it a little bit right now too, is that it's a very, very difficult space to manage. Me coming into it, and when I started offering wellness services in school districts, was extremely naive to the type of bureaucracy and the type of language that we have to be aware of when we're navigating the school system. There was many a time, and to be fair, going into, and to give you a full picture of it, right? I am a South Asian woman. I'm going into spaces, in public school spaces in Texas, and I'm trying to talk about why it's important to employ Sanskrit in the school, in the classroom. I didn't have it easy at all, but I definitely didn't understand the different places that are holding this. And it's weird because we've talked a little bit about this in our community hour too, but it's like, while I talk about that, with adults, it's more on learning, whereas with children, it's a fresh introduction. Children are connected to adults in any part that you're having your introduction with them. So even when you're dealing with children, you're still going to have to deal with the component of adults on learning in that process. And the same approach that I feel like has been helpful for me has been the same approach I talked about with children. Adults in these spaces also need to know the what and why behind certain things that are being implemented. And I think a lot of that has to come from educational spaces. In my experience with research, kids love data, but adults need data to validate these practices. Adults need data to understand and to be able to create a premise for why these practices need to exist. For me, it had to come down to creating a deck of said research says X% of people can benefit from these practices. Going back to the roots of the practice, talking about the foundations of the practice and why they're important. You're going to have to, your approach per group has to be different. And I'm with you, and I feel you deeply in this moment because it is exhausting, the conversations you have to have. And you almost, in that way where you're trying to now just be this conduit for giving these practices to children, ultimately have to become the soundboard for fragility, which is intense. it's intense, and it's not something that, thinking about, I mean, Leah, I don't even know if this is something that you thought about going into offering these practices. I had no idea that this is going to be a portion of what I was going to experience in what I was trying to do with implementing yoga in the school system. And I quickly had to learn that similar to how we think about our approach for children is how we have to think about the adults that they're associated with. So if we're thinking now, and if you're not working in a studio and you're working specifically with the school system, you have to think about the bureaucracy behind the systems and people in positions of power, and giving them the data that they need to begin to implement the practices. Ultimately, this is what happens to me. And I hope that with more conversation and more empowering tools in education, we're able to come from a more informed space. But for me, a lot of it had to rethink who I'm associating myself and needing levels of receptivity from certain spaces for me to feel like I could authentically give instead of having to take away those practices. I too had to think, do I not say certain words? Do I not do certain things? But not saying the name of the practice and practicing the practice is also causing harm. So being in that position exactly where you are right now, thinking about my approach per group, but also having to reassess and re-understand where I feel like these tools are going to be honored and respected, and having to take a step back from spaces where I feel like it's almost doing more harm than good. But we'll talk more about that in actionable items, and we're going to have a little bit more discourse on that. But just to give you a little bit of context on my personal journey there. All right. With this, I want to talk about how kids yoga is currently, and all the cringe is coming up. However, a quick disclaimer: just like yoga is for adults, it is not all colonized or appropriated. We have spaces in adults yoga that is equitable, that is doing the work, that is working to honor the practice, that is trying actively to undo harm. We have yoga teacher trainings that are working in that space, that are creating a more equitable practice, accessible, trauma-informed. We have practitioners, we have yoga studios that are moving in that direction. Exactly similar to that, these spaces do exist within children's yoga spaces. It's not that they don't. However, for the purposes of our conversation here, we're discussing the spaces that I have personally experienced and can have the majority and have come across the years that do not have the parallels that we are speaking about here when it comes to social emotional learning, Montessori philosophy, and honoring the roots of the practice. So I just want to give a quick disclaimer of, this is not all of what children's yoga is like. However, this is the majority of how children's yoga is like. And what we're trying to accomplish here is to just get a clear picture of what we're seeing, and then to try to assess that with the parallels that we've now created. All right. So the way that we see it more now, and the way that I've come across it, is extremely rooted in fantasy. And like we've mentioned with Jillian before, fantasy isn't harmful for children that have their cortex developed and can be in a space where they're ready to take on abstract concepts. However, for yoga to be fully associated with fantasy is neither conducive to the practice of yoga. It is neither conducive to the way that children learn. As we've noticed, it's extremely fitness and workout focused. We see this with adults in many spaces, and we also see this with children. So I'll give you an example of me being in the school space, and a lot of the conversation I would have with the educators or the staff, faculty, when we were beginning to talk about these techniques, is like, yeah, I really like, and I was having surveys during before and after because of the research was super exciting to me. But a lot of the feedback that I would get from educators is like, my kids need to move. Like, we brought you here to move them. They're not moving. They're breathing, or they're laying, or they're journaling. This is not movement. I need them to shake it out. I need them to get rid of all the jitters so that they can focus in the classroom. So a lot of even what we directly associate yoga with as fitness and workout in the adult space is extremely similar to the children's yoga space. A lot of it is around fun, playful movement, and it's taking out that seriousness in the sense of understanding the deeper concepts behind yoga and why they work the way that they do. So one example to give you just with the way that adults yoga is seen in the West here is that the languaging around it and the way that it's introduced is what takes away its validity, right? the way that I found to give it that seat at the table as a nervous system pacifying science is to talk about the data behind it, is to talk about why it works, right? So similar to how we see it with adults yoga, of it not having the validity of it being an actual science, is similar to how it is with kids. It's just something that's supposed to be playful and movement like, but like we talked about the needs and wants of children, we have to be giving them that more empowering techniques of what this is doing for you and why this is important. We're not just here practicing yoga and having a fun little 20-minute session together. You're getting some really cool tools to be able to implement in your own day, your week, and with your relationships with people outside of you. Most of modern day kids yoga does not utilize all 8 limbs of yoga. It is extremely asana focused, and even within asana, if you've had experience with the different names that are called for different poses, there are all sorts of things. I've come across like the weirdest names for certain asana postures for kids, and it's all about just keeping them engaged. I know Tejal and I laughed about like some of the ones we've come across, like what in the world are they referring to? But thinking about like just making this a fun practice and having it all being movement focused instead of thinking about what is this asana doing for you. If you've had experience in your own practicing, if you've been practicing, or if you've learned, if you've gone through a teacher training, you've have an established practice your own, we know what each asana pose is doing. We know the whole reason why we do them. We know the sequence and the way that we do them. We know why we choose that sequence, right? If you have familiarity with Ayurveda and yoga are sibling sciences, so they're meant to complement one another. And all that Ayurveda does when it comes to yoga asana is about how do we help improve the body, the digestive system, all the different movements. How do we pacify the nervous system to be able to then continue journeying down the path of yoga? All of this information is also imperative for children as well. But in my experience, and not as frequently, I haven't seen a lot of the yamas, the niyamas, pranayama, meditation, mudras, marmani, acupressure points, all these different things that are a larger part of yoga are not implemented in the way that we currently see kids yoga. There's a lot of sensory overload. There's many yoga videos out there on YouTube of children's yoga, and we see the way that it is right now, and it's loud. It has a lot of different moving parts. It has a lot of different elements to it that when you think about yoga and we think about taking away sensory overload to be able to come deeply into the practice, I almost feel that it's kind of doing the opposite and it's counterproductive in that sense. So thinking about yoga inherently is meant to be practiced in a way that's strengthening the relationship and taking away from stimuli. And so current yoga for children and the way that it has a sensory overload is not entirely conducive to that. And of course, in many ways, it can't be trauma informed as well. Kids yoga, similar to the way that kids learn in the classroom, the public school space, is instructor-led versus child-led. Same thing. You'll see in yoga studios across the country that have been following this really westernized model. It's taking everybody in the classroom, despite the journey that they're on, despite the conditions that they're held, despite wherever their dosha is and wherever they currently are, and giving them all one place to take it from and using that as a place or a foundation for people to build off of. So again, taking people, unique beings, and pressing them into one space. Sometimes we see a lot of children's yoga having a similar format of instructor leading, child just doing. And with children here, I think is so different with our approach is that in order to be able to satiate the needs of children, we really have to have it extremely child-led, and to be able to break it down per group or even per individual to be able to best assist their needs and giving them the tools they need to go on their own journey instead of allowing them to push into more systems. So if we're thinking about a child being in a public school system with a lack of resources, and then we give them this form of yoga that's, again, putting them into a box, lack of resources, not giving them the education that they need to understand why they're doing what we're doing, we're kind of doubling down in that way. So if the intentionality here is to allow yoga to be something that's empowering for them, however, if we're turning it around and we're using the same systems now that's already not conducive to their learning, we could almost be creating more harm than doing good, right? And it's not rooted in research regarding how children learn and the tools that they need to pacify their nervous system. So we've been talking about this a lot. but really thinking about what works per child, and also thinking about why the practices are important and why they need to be implemented and be rooted in research and rooted in factual knowledge, versus we just think this is fun and we want to implement this and kids are going to get a little bit of a movement. So this is how we've seen it currently. Now I'm going to go back here for a second. That doesn't fit this parallel that we've spoken about. It doesn't fit this parallel that we see in the way that yoga philosophy is meant to be practiced, the totality of the practice itself, Montessori philosophy, and social emotional learning. So we have two big components here, right? We're talking about what all these things are, how we can see these clear parallels between the way that children are learning and the way that yoga is to be introduced. And now we see the way that yoga is currently and the way that children are learning currently. It's not matching up. So we have a big bridge to gap. We ourselves as adults in this situation have many obstacles to journey from this space to the other. How are we going to do that, right? So we'll talk a little bit about the ways that we can bridge these gaps. However, honoring the discourse and the discussion I spoke about earlier, I invite you all to be part of this discussion. And I think there is a few of us that we can even do this in one group, or we can break into 2 groups of 5 in our breakout rooms. And actually, I do have breakout room prompts. So you're welcome to write this down. I'll also put this in the chat for you to be able to use later. But what has your current experience with kids yoga been like? So a little bit about your background, allowing that to guide the questions and the discussion. What gaps have you noticed in how yoga is being taught and how children are learning it? And what do you think are the different ways that we can begin to bridge these gaps? Now, a lot of these discourse and conversation can also just be around your personal experience and the roadblocks that you're finding, and a lot less solution. But I truly feel like this is a foundational step for us to begin to address these gaps, is to start having this discourse, which I invite to be a part of our workshop today. So I'll go ahead and also drop these in the chat. But Thejal, if you could help me get us into breakout rooms so we can start having some discussion. All right, we are now coming back into the main room from our breakout rooms that we had around really great conversation of what we've experienced in our own personal timelines and our experiences with implementing or attempting to implement yoga and mindfulness in schools. And really looking forward to opening up here the discussion when everybody else comes back into the room. So we'll give it like 30 seconds. And they're back. Okay, cool. Welcome back. We are back from the breakout room. I know when people don't come back, when that button comes up, it means that there was a good conversation going on, which excites me. So we have just about a few minutes left, but I do want to open it up for some group shares. So if anybody would like to share what they talked about in their breakout room, something that really stood out to them, something that they feel like is an approach that they're going to take on, I would love to hear it. So any shares, y'all? Thanks, Teresa and Carrie, for chatting. Ooh, what happened in this breakout room? Tell me.
Oh, I just like talking to people about children's yoga and learning about other people's journeys onto their children's yoga journey.
Yeah.
But I didn't get a chance to say that before we closed down. But it was thank you for chatting.
Oh, yay. All right.
Well, since I'm talking, I'll say something that I thought was interesting is that how much I know we were kind of saying this in our conversation was that there's more information now on how to languaging and bringing yoga to children and how to speak it in different places. I've been doing this for 9 years. So I've seen the trajectory of children's yoga from it being very circusy, very poses all over the place, which was great because I learned one way. But when I started going into the public school system, and even in each school, district, community, I have to alter and say things differently. But now that there's more language and ways to approach it so that I could teach the students where I teach in the Bronx or in Harlem, I'd be like, do you know where yoga's from? Can we have a discussion where it's from? Like, how do you know yoga? Because a lot of the kids only know yoga from like white abled bodies who can move, skinny, and they could do all this stuff. And I was like, no, that's not what it is.
Right.
But we have discussions now on, I'm like, well, let me tell you where it's coming from. I'm gonna tell you, and I'm gonna tell you how old it is. And then it kind of gets them intrigued. I'm like, oh, really? Sometimes they don't believe me, but I'm like, no, it is. And then telling them like it's from India, and they're like, no, that's not real, no. So even having conversations of understanding the historical significance and what yoga can be and what it can do throughout the day, but finding places like this, like workshops like this, that can have more language and more ways to explain it has been very helpful. But so yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. Would anybody else like to share before we wrap it up for today? All good? All right, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen once more. Whoop. Not that. This. Okay, cool. Alrighty. So some of these things I also happened to discuss in the group that I was in, which was awesome because this is exactly where we were going for. So really thinking about here systemic change. When we talk about when we are introducing this material to children, we are also introducing this material to the adults that are involved, especially if you're in the school system, you're dealing with faculty and staff. There's a lot of bureaucracy around the way that things are introduced and then the words and the language that we can use. So starting to think about, can we even have yoga teacher trainings that are focused for staff and faculty? Can there be trainings and PDs, professional developments, continuing education that have that correlation between decolonized yoga and wellness and social emotional learning? So starting to think here big picture about what can we do within the system itself to be able to have the legwork done in the way that people are coming trained to these programs, instead of when we go in to implement the programs, you're doing a lot of work around fragility and introduction and unlearning and relearning, right? So knowing that we have these parallels, how can these parallels now be introduced in the school system of how social emotional learning and yoga are actually inherently one and the same and why they complement each other very beautifully? How can this be a part of the training that educators receive? How can we think about that systemically? Rethinking ourselves in our own ways of the current ways that we interact with children, the yoga that they're exposed to, and the way that they're learning it, right? So like one important part is like how not to appropriate kids yoga. The other big part of it that we've talked about here is to do it in the way that they learn best. So really thinking about those components of Montessori philosophy and social emotional learning. And then to start challenging that dialogue, right? So thinking and talking more about why is yoga important at the home and school, going into the schools. If you have a child, talking to their teacher, talking to faculty and staff, really starting to create more dialogue and discourse around that, normalizing why this practice could be utilized more. And also talking about why the current ways that we are learning or taking in yoga is not conducive to the way that children are learning. So if you're in a space and you're noticing that children are watching a certain video that has more stimuli, that is more fun-based, to begin to question the systems behind why this is what we think yoga is, and to begin start that discourse and dialogue around it. So those are some of the things that we can start thinking about as we work towards to implement it. Now, this is beginning of a very, very deep and important conversation and discourse and dialogue on just knowledge and information about these parallels. I hope this is something that just opens up to something larger, and hopefully we can continue having more gatherings like this where we can come together and talk about these gaps, and then ultimately as a community move forward to creating the different systemic changes we need. But in our individual timelines, at the very least, to begin with our allyship, just like we have in spaces where we're working to decolonize yoga, is to show that same, passion to have children having access to yoga, but also now being very, very conscious of how what they're getting currently could be extremely harmful for their development, and how it can ultimately impact them negatively going down the road. So slides wise, that was all the material I had presented for you. Because we are out of time, I wish we could talk about this more and more and more, but if you would like to reach out, if you have questions, if you want to continue the conversations, please feel free to reach out to me. I know this is not the end of the journey for our discussions here for children's yoga, especially at Tejal Yoga, so please stay connected to all that we're doing. And we hope to have more of these workshops and conversations and dialogues around how it is we can come together to bridge these gaps. And I hope that you found value in our time here together. I hope that talking about Montessori philosophy and social emotional learning and working together to have those visuals and those parallel help to, this is so important. Oh, I'm back. I hope so that conversation helped to shed some light on how important these parallels are, how we can implement them. And I hope that it begins to spark change, at least in our dialogues, at least in our interactions with the children that we're seeing, and hopefully to start creating those waves of change and systemic change in this space. Really quickly, I just want to give my gratitude to each one of you for being here today, for entertaining something that I'm extremely, extremely grateful for. I'm really grateful for all of your presence, and a moment of gratitude for these yogic practices and teachers indigenous to South Asia in our efforts in working to reclaim. Gratitude, acknowledgement for the land that we're all seated on today. And just taking a moment, taking a deep breath in. Let it go. Rubbing the palms together. We'll create some heat, some energy, some friction, all that we've cultivated in our time here together, all the passion that I hope goes on, carries with us in our own timelines, washing it over the face, arms, legs, anywhere else you need it today. Give yourself a hug. Showing up for and having difficult conversations around some of these topics is truly an act of courage. So thank you so much for being brave with me today. We'll close with a message you may wish to repeat. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. May all beings everywhere, including ourselves, be in peace. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank you all for joining. I just wanted to make sure that you know the recording will come out on Friday, and that as this whole workshop is fresh, I'm just dropping in the chat a link that you can click and just open in your browser window, come back to, or maybe you're ready to offer some reflections for Rabia now. That would be really lovely so that she could read them. And then finally, as you close out, if you want to say maybe one word or one thought that you'll be thinking about or taking with you as you go, that would be a really lovely way to close out the room.
I'll share. Community.
Committed.
You're also welcome to send a chat if that feels most comfortable.
I think social emotional learning. That's the one.
I like that one. Thanks, Carrie. Alrighty, y'all. Thank you so much for joining today. Hopefully we'll all be connecting sometime soon, but thanks for joining. Bye.
Bye, take care.